What is this strange bird, and what is it doing in our stained glass window? The short answer? It's the phoenix, a legendary bird portrayed in literature and art from ancient times to the present. For Christians, it symbolizes Christ and the resurrection, and it can offer us hope and challenge in the present time. This semicircular window is located in the tympanum, above one of the east entrance doors at St. Joseph's. The shape of the window is part of the Romanesque architecture of the building. The filler designs painted on the glass are similar to scrollwork decorations often found in ancient Roman art, such as this detail from the Ara Pacis in Rome. Many of the window designs and carvings at St. Joe's reproduce such traditional Roman motifs, with curving vines and stylized acanthus leaves. The central subject of the window is a bright medallion containing the figure of an eagle-like bird emerging from fire on a brilliant red and purple background. The phoenix is described by ancient Greek and Roman writers as living for 500 to over 1,000 years. When it was time for the bird to die, it would prepare its own funeral nest out of spices, incense, and myrrh, and then come to life again out of its own remains. In some stories, the phoenix would die and rise again in fire. Although they were skeptical about the details, ancient writers did not doubt the existence of the bird. Christian thinkers associated the phoenix with resurrection, both the rising of Jesus from the dead and our resurrection at the end of history. But where did these legends come from, and what exactly did they say? The story of the phoenix, from ancient Egypt through classical antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the modern world to today, is traced by Joseph Nigg in his 2016 book, The Phoenix, an Unnatural Biography of a Mythical Beast. There are many appearances of the phoenix in literature and art throughout history. That's the short story. If you want the long story, listen on. We will examine a few of the more prominent and relevant sources that Joseph Nigg identified, and they will take us on a ride from the ancient world through the Middle Ages. Two historians from classical antiquity laid the foundations for the legend of the phoenix: Herodotus, a Greek, and Tacitus, a Roman. Herodotus of Halicarnassus lived in the 5th century, or 400s BC. His book, The Histories, is best known for his account of the Persian Wars, but he also relates details from his travels through the Mediterranean world, including to Egypt, where he says he encountered the story of the phoenix.
Another sacred bird is the phoenix. I have not seen a phoenix myself, except in paintings, for it is very rare and visits the country, so at least they say in Heliopolis, only at intervals of 500 years, on the occasion of the death of the parent bird. To judge by the paintings, its plumage is partly golden, partly red, and in shape and size it is exactly like an eagle. There is a story about the phoenix. It brings its parents in a lump of myrrh, all the way from Arabia, and buries the body in the temple of the sun. Such, at least, is the story.
Here we have a legend of a rare and beautiful bird associated with the Egyptian god of the sun, remarkable most for its filial piety, or reverence for its parent, an important virtue in the classical world. This is shown in the effort the young bird expends to bring its father's body to the temple of the sun in Heliopolis, a Greek name meaning city of the sun. This ancient Egyptian city, originally called Iunu, was indeed a center of sun worship. Today it is a suburb of Cairo, But according to Nig, an ancient obelisk marks the site of the original temple. Like our stained glass window, the bird has the look of an eagle, although it is more colorful. Herodotus says nothing, however, about fire or about the resurrection of the bird. He only mentions its longevity, its association with the sun, its rare appearance, and its supposed use of spices in embalming its parent. He is careful to note that he has not seen this phenomenon for himself, but only heard of it from residents of Heliopolis, and seen pictures of it in art. According to Nig, we cannot be sure what art Herodotus referred to, but it is possible that his idea of the phoenix was connected with the ancient Egyptian idea of the Bennu, a heron-like bird, considered to be a manifestation of the creator sun god Ra, and a guide for departed souls on their journey through the underworld. This portrayal of the Bennu is from a heart amulet placed with a body at least 500 years before Herodotus. This line drawing makes it easier to see the bird. If Nig is correct, then the phoenix story told by Herodotus has even older roots in the culture and religion of ancient Egypt. To meet our second ancient historian, we must travel northwest across the Mediterranean Sea to Rome, and forward in time about 500 years. In his book, The Annals, the Roman historian Tacitus recounts the political drama surrounding the reigns of the emperors Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero, a period from roughly AD 14 through 68. Tacitus is a careful historian, sifting fact from fiction as best he can in his time, yet also sharing his personal views about the people and events he records. He inserts his discussion of the Phoenix into a chapter on a time of upheaval in the reign of Tiberius. Rome suffered through a period of inflation, an economic recession, and a rash of executions and suicides of Tiberius' political enemies, real or suspected. In the midst of these many sorrows which saddened Rome, the Phoenix once again appeared in Egypt. Here is Tacitus' account.
During the consulship of Paulus Flavius and Lucius Vitellius, the bird called the phoenix, after a long succession of ages, appeared in Egypt, and furnished the most learned men of that country and Greece with abundant matter for discussion of the marvelous phenomenon. It is my wish to make known all on which they agree, with several things, questionable enough indeed, but not too absurd to be noticed. That it is a creature sacred to the sun, different from all other birds in its beak and in the tints of its plumage, is held unanimously by those who have described its nature. As to the number of years it lives, there are various accounts. The general tradition says 500 years. Some maintain that it is seen at intervals of 1,461 years, and that the former birds flew into the city called Heliopolis successively in the reigns of Sesostris, Amasis, and Ptolemy, the third king of Macedonian dynasty, with a multitude of companion birds marveling at the novelty of its appearance. But all antiquity is, of course, obscure. From Ptolemy to Tiberius was a period of less than 500 years. Consequently, some have supposed that this was a spurious phoenix, not from the regions of Arabia, and with none of the instincts which an ancient tradition has attributed to the bird. For when the number of years is completed and death is near, the phoenix, it is said, builds a nest in the land of its birth and infuses into it a germ of life, from which an offspring arises, whose first care, when fledged, is to bury its father. This is not rashly done, but taking up a load of myrrh, and having tried its strength by long flight, as soon as it is equal to the burden and to the journey, it carries its father's body, bears it to the altar of the sun, and leaves it to the flames. All this is full of doubt and legendary exaggeration. Still, it is no question that the bird is occasionally seen in Egypt.
Tacitus' description is similar to that of Herodotus, but he adds 3 key details and a new layer of meaning, as well as a dose of skepticism. Those details explain more of the features in our window. First, he describes the bird as knowing when its own death is near and preparing a nest. Second, he adds the sexless generation of the new bird, which is born without mating from a seed put into the nest by the old bird. And third, that the body of the parent bird is burned up by fire on the altar of the sun in Heliopolis. Here we still see the concern for filial piety. Ancient Romans took great care to bury their parents correctly and to care for their ancestors' graves. Finally, Tacitus seems to imply that the appearance of the phoenix could mark turning points in history. He is in the midst of describing the terrible tumult and violence associated with the end of Tiberius' reign, and he notes the intervals of the phoenix appearance in Egyptian history. Tacitus may have seen that moment as the end of one chapter in Roman history and the beginning of another. The Roman poet Martial does something similar with the metaphor of the phoenix in his epigrams, comparing the long-lived city of Rome with the long-lived bird whose life is renewed by fire. Nigg suggests that the graceful heron-like bird depicted on Roman coins is a phoenix, symbolizing the eternal city and the enduring succession of its emperors. For Christian readers, it can be meaningful that Tacitus' appearance of the phoenix took place around AD 34, when the young Christian community emerged in Israel-Palestine. For Christians, this is the central turning point in our view of history. These classical accounts of the phoenix by Herodotus and Tacitus show us the beginnings of a sort of tradition about the phoenix, an idea that was preserved, embroidered, handed on, and reinterpreted by later Roman and Christian authors. There are far too many Christian representations of the phoenix in literature and art for us to examine them all in this brief exploration. We will focus on 4 writers: Clement, Tertullian, Pseudo-Lactantius, and Isidore of Seville, and then take a look at medieval bestiaries. Clement and Tertullian are considered patristic writers, or fathers of the Church, because as Catholics we regard their contributions to theology as foundational. Clement I, or Clement of Rome, lived in the 1st century AD, around the same time as Tacitus and the writers of the New Testament. He served as the Bishop of Rome at the end of the century. As Catholics, we consider him the 3rd Pope, succeeding Peter. An important early Christian text, the letter to the Corinthians, is attributed to him. This letter, or epistle, is similar in form to Paul's letters in the New Testament. Like Paul, Clement admonishes the Christians at Corinth, a city in Greece, for the conflict and division which has arisen among them. He urges them to seek reconciliation and peace with each other, reminding them that the final resurrection, which is also the final judgment, is coming. It is in this context that Clement brings up the phoenix. He is arguing for the reasonableness of believing in a future resurrection from death by pointing to natural cycles in the cosmos. He writes, "The night sinks to sleep, and the day arises. The sower goes forth and casts grain into the ground. Though dry and naked when it fell upon the earth, out of its dissolution the mighty power of the Lord raises it up again." After this quote, Clement then repeats a story of the phoenix almost identical to Tacitus, though simplified. Clement's purpose is different from Tacitus, however. He is seeking to strengthen his reader's faith in a religious idea which seems improbable. That is, the claim that we as human beings can experience a physical life beyond death, that our bodies will rise again on the last day when Christ returns in glory, even if we have been dead for hundreds, even thousands of years. The phoenix story is a piece of his argument, joined to examples of change and renewal from nature, night leading to day, seeds growing into plants. Clement attributes these natural phenomena to God's dunamis, or energy, working all around us in nature. Such a worldview challenges our modern imaginations, a question we will take up later. Our second Christian witness, Tertullian, uses the phoenix story in the same way in his treatise On the Resurrection of the Flesh. Tertullian was a leader in the church in North Africa in the 2nd century, or AD 100s, a couple of generations after Clement. He lived through times of persecution, when Christians were executed for their faith. The courage of the martyrs was likely part of what attracted him to Christianity. Tertullian was concerned with apologetics, defending Christian beliefs in the face of criticism, and he is credited with developing a distinctive church style of Latin. In this writing, he's arguing against non-Christians who disparage the dignity of the body, and against Christians who do not believe in the resurrection of the body. In part of the essay, chapter 12, Tertullian takes Clement's reasoning and spins it into a more flowery tapestry of poetic phrases. He describes analogies in nature for the resurrection, including the appearance of the stars and the dawn, the phases of the moon, the changing of the seasons from fall into spring, and all their loveliness. God has written the resurrection, he says, in the creation, before writing it in Scripture. In the following chapter, Tertullian brings in the phoenix, regarding it as an even stronger argument. He assumes that the reader is already familiar with the story of the phoenix, because he does not repeat it. What he does say reveals an important shift in his view of what the phoenix is.
I refer to the bird which is peculiar to the East, famous for its singularity, marvellous from its posthumous life, which renews its life in a voluntary death. Its dying day is its birthday, for on it departs and returns, once more himself, another, yet the same.
Tertullian is claiming that the young phoenix, which emerges from the remains of the dead bird, is the same bird. And if a bird can have a resurrection, why not people? This is different from Herodotus, Tacitus, and even Clement, who viewed the new bird as the offspring or baby of the old one. Tertullian also finds the phoenix in the Bible. He quotes Psalm 92, verse 12, "The just one shall flourish like the palm tree." The version of the Bible he was reading, however, was written not in the original Hebrew, but in a Greek translation called the Septuagint. The Greek word for palm tree is phoenix, which can also mean phoenix, and this is how Tertullian reads it. The just one shall flourish like the phoenix. Tertullian regards this as a biblical promise of resurrection. These are new and distinctively Christian interpretations of the phoenix story. There is one more classical writing, which may or may not be Christian, that we cannot ignore before we leave the ancient world. It is not history, like Herodotus and Tacitus. It is not theological argument, like Clement and Tertullian. It is poetry. The text, entitled Carmen de Ave Phoenicae, Song about the Phoenix Bird, has been attributed to Lactantius, although scholars today question this attribution. Lactantius was a Christian convert who lived from the 3rd to 4th centuries AD, and served as tutor to the son of the Roman Emperor Constantine. This emperor was also a convert to Christianity, and established the legal protection of religious freedom in AD 313, in effect freeing Christians from the threat of persecution. The poem is written in Latin, in dactylic hexameter, the meter of epic poetry. It describes in vivid imagery the earthly paradise where the phoenix lives, her joyful salutation of the sun, and her voluntary embrace of death, culminating in renewed life. Although the poem is filled with Greek and Roman mythological references and never explicitly mentions Christian beliefs, it expresses themes which resonate deeply for a Christian reader: delight in the beauty of nature, the idea of Eden, morning prayer, a glorious semi-divine being who enters the human realm to die and begets itself, the idea that death can bring about new life. The text was influential to later Christian writers. The poem is too long to repeat it all, so we will consider just a few verses that add details to the story of the phoenix. Et conversa novos foibi nascentis ad ortus, expectat radios et iubar ex oriens, at cubi sol pepulit fulgentis limina portae, et primi emiquit luminis aura levis. Incipit illa sacri modulamina fundere cantus, et mira lucem voce referre noam, quam neca edo meae vocis, nec tibia posit, musica cire is assimilare modis. In these verses, the phoenix is portrayed as flying to the top of a tall tree in the early morning to wait for the dawn. When she sees the first rays of the sun, she bursts into song, a song more beautiful than any earthly music we can imagine. It is like a morning prayer, and the next verses continue the theme of prayer by describing how the bird venerates the fiery sun and continues singing throughout the day and night, dividing the hours. As Catholics, we recognize in these verses an echo of the Liturgy of the Hours, the ancient Christian practice of 7 times daily prayer. Once the phoenix has reached 1,000 years of age, she actively seeks out death in order to renew the cycle of time itself, as well as her own life. She leaves her Eden-like garden home in the east and flies to this world where death reigns supreme. She picks fragrant spices like cinnamon and builds her nest out of them, the nest which is also a tomb. Then she gives over her spirit, animam commendat, a phrase that echoes the death of Jesus in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. But now the phoenix wondrously renews herself. Here, Lactantius adds a detail that becomes an important part of the phoenix story going forward. The bird itself produces the fire that consumes her body. Meanwhile, her body, destroyed from the regenerative death, glows, and that heat itself brings forth the flames, and from afar it catches fire from the ethereal light. Her body burns, and roasted, crumbles into ashes. From these ashes emerges a worm, which turns into an egg, and out of this egg the renewed phoenix hatches, like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. The young phoenix carries the ashes to an unnamed temple, then returns to her distant eastern home, resplendent with colorful feathers and crowned with a halo of radiance. There is much more to this poem. It is definitely worth reading in its entirety, and there's a wonderful translation by Teresa Hooper at academia.edu. According to Joseph Nigg, the De Awe Phoenicae influenced later Christian writers and medieval bestiaries. This concludes part 1 of our exploration. I hope to have you with me in part 2 for the rest.